We are going back to Roddy now for our message. This one really struck with me. One of my late partner, Ray's great-grandson, totally unexpected to everyone around him, took his own life. It was Valentine's 3 years ago, and the family is still grieving, doing things of remembrance. So I really appreciate your topic this.
As Nancy just said, today's topic is on suicide. And so breathe, center in, and arrive. Believe it or not, suicide affects us all. I personally don't know anyone who has not been affected by suicide in some way or another. It is that impactful in our society. To help us understand how a single suicide can affect so many people, I want you to do something with me this morning. With your eyes open or closed as you are comfortable, I want you to imagine that you have a large pond in front of you. Once you have that image in your mind, I want you to imagine that you also have a smooth pebble or pebbles in your hand, and that you're skipping them along the surface of the pond, watching as each creates its ripple in the water before sinking to the bottom. If you chose to close your eyes, you may open them for a bit now. Suicide is much like these pebbles skipping in a pond. For when it comes to suicide, the waves or the effects of suicide ripple outward. What I mean by that is that when someone dies by suicide, the people impacted most dramatically and immediately are those closest to the person who died, the immediate family members, their closest friends, their co-workers, their classmates, those who see this person daily. However, these people only represent the first wave, the initial level of impact that a suicide creates. We can all be impacted by a suicide. When we look deeper, we see that members of the individual's community, such as a faith community like this one, or those who may not have known the person, are also affected. So too are affected the mental health service providers, the doctors, the first responders, etc. And all of those who might have seen them or heard about them or not even known them before their time of death, those who provided care right after such a tragedy. These groups, these people may feel the impact of a suicide in ways that feel similar to those closest to the person who has died, but they will be feeling them in different ways and at different times. These groups now represent the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and so on ripples in a pond. All have been affected by the loss of one life, ultimately in the same way that a pond is forever changed by skipping pebbles across its surface. So is an entire community affected and changed by a single suicide death. Before moving forward this morning, let us take a moment to collect our thoughts, to breathe, and to bring our minds and bodies more fully present into this gathered community into this space, into this sacred and brave space where we can talk about hard and challenging, sometimes unpleasant things. So, friends, take a moment and do that now. Returning from our silence, we come to the hard part, actually talking in depth about suicide. But to do so, we need to be clear on a few things: what a suicide is and what a suicide attempt is. So, by definition, suicide is when someone directs violence at themselves with the intent of ending their own life and die as a direct result because of their actions. And by definition, a suicide attempt is when someone harms themselves with the intent of ending their own lives, but do not die as a direct result because of their actions. With this in mind, it is also best to avoid terms like commit suicide or successful suicide when referring to the death of someone by suicide, as these often have negative connotations. We will look at this more in a moment, but I just want to put it out there. I also want to be clear here. I am not a mental health expert, and I do not claim to be one. I have struggled and to this day still struggle with my own mental health. I also want to be clear that I have no concrete answers. I do not have a magic wand that I can wave to make this topic any easier to understand, to engage with, or to go away. I also know that many communities, especially faith communities, have hurt people when it comes to suicide. So if you have been hurt by a faith community, I am sorry. So at any point during today's service, during today's sermon, if you need to leave, please know that you can do so. In the chat, I am placing my email. If you do leave, I ask that you email me and that we schedule a time to talk, to connect, so that I can hold you in love and community together. That's an open invitation to any of you. Even if you do not leave this space this morning, if weeks from now, days from now, you need to reach out, you need someone to talk to, know that you too can use my email, and I would love to speak with you. So we know that there are no underlining ideas, or that there are underlining ideas that we cannot speak of suicide, that we must stay silent. But those are so wrong, for we can and we must speak of suicide if we wish to attempt to understand it, if we wish to attempt to help those who suffer with thoughts of suicide, who struggle with mental health challenges, and if we wish to heal communities impacted by suicide, then we must talk about it. For myself and the millions of others who suffer with mental health, the most challenging and painful thing that we have to deal with is not the mental health challenge itself, but is the stigmas that are so often associated with mental health issues put on all of us by society. People are often not educated on mental health and have no idea what it's like to live with a mental health challenge. So they become quick to judge and to make jokes about it, in a sense, to lighten the issue. However, doing so only makes it worse for those living with mental health challenges on a daily basis. Mental health is nothing to joke about, and it needs to be treated the same way as if someone were to break a bone. It takes time to heal, it takes time to process, and the stigmas around mental health and suicide only make that healing process harder. They only make that process drawn out. They only hurt those who are struggling. And sometimes the stigmas are too much to bear, and they lead to the loss of life. Some people's mental health issues might be an isolated moment in their lifetime, lasting a short amount of time, while others, like mine, might be something that they live with for the rest of their lives. No matter the type of mental health issue someone might have, it is important to remember that mental health is a personal life journey, that no one person's mental health journey is ever going to be the same, and that is okay. It is important to realize that the stigmas around mental health and mental health challenges must come to an end. Stigmas around mental health only lead to silence, and silence about suicide loss does not stop the ripple effect. It only leaves people feeling even more isolated, as if what they are facing, as if the tragedy that has just occurred, they are doing so all alone. When someone dies by suicide, the aftermath, though it is hard, opens up the immediate opportunity to talk about suicide as a public health issue that affects us all. We all have a role to play in its prevention, in its decreasing, and in ending the stigmas around mental health and suicide. So, switching gears just a little bit, though not entirely, we respond to suicide in so many ways, and they are all rational. They all make sense in the brain. Some are more useful than others, but know that if you have responded to suicide in one of these ways that I am about to mention and talk about for just a moment, that it is okay to admit it, learn from, and move into a direction that is most helpful. So, the first one, we mourn the sudden loss of life. This is no different than if someone is dying of cancer. If someone dies in a car crash, we mourn that loss. We hold them, we remember them, we honor them, and we celebrate their life. One that is a little bit different, that we don't necessarily do in a car crash, for example, is often we become quick to blame ourselves. We call this the if onlys. They show up in ways such as, if only I had noticed that they weren't at that meeting and reached out to them. If only I had called them the night before and checked in. If only, if only, if only. Know that this is real, but also know that sometimes, for reasons that we'll go into in a moment, the if onlys, the warning signs, become very hard to recognize. Another one that we do when it comes to suicide that we don't do in a car crash, for example, is we become angry and we don't know why, but we become angry at ourselves, at them, and we refer to this as the how could. So this shows up in ways of, how could they do this to me, to their community? How could they leave their family, their children behind? Don't they know their worth? Don't they know their dignity? Don't they know that they'll be missed? And all of these questions bubble up inside of us and lead to an anger that we can't explain nor understand. Sometimes we try to make sense of suicide. We try to find the truth of suicide. We try to piece together a narrative that coheres to logic, but we can't. Not really. For because of the stigmas associated with suicide, we can never really know fully someone else's thoughts. We can only know what they tell us. And those stigmas around suicide, around mental health, add to the ways that we mourn, the ways that we blame ourselves about suicide, the ways in which we become angry about suicide. And so it's important to notice and to realize that someone may be struggling with mental health. They may be thinking about ending their own lives, but they may hold it in. They may tell us in society what they know we want to hear because it is easier than opening up, because they never know if those stigmas are going to follow them when they do. So again, I invite you to take a breath. This is a hard topic to talk about, but it is one that we must talk about. Again, we're only scratching the surface of a very complex topic. So if you want to have a conversation to go deeper into this topic, my email is in the chat, and you are welcome to do so as well, even if you yourself are not struggling with thoughts of suicide or mental health challenges to the level of which you cannot handle on your own. That is a resource for you. So switching gears again, just a little bit, I want to do something else. So I'm going to share a story with you of suicide. But before I do, either by a show of hands or by placing the answer yes or no in the chat, I want you to answer this question for me. The question is this: how many of you know that there are 7 stories of suicide in the Bible? So either by a show of hands, if you do know so, or in the chat if you don't. And I'll give you just a moment to do that now. So I'm seeing in the chat that everyone who is putting an answer in has said no. Know that you are not alone in knowing this. I have given this sermon now about 6 times, some in person and some remote like this one. And that is the answer that I get. But there are 7 stories of suicide in the Hebrew Bible, and not one of them refer to it as a sin. But they use words such as having a great remorse, a great loss, a time of great sadness, of great pain, and so on. One of the more common stories of suicide in the Bible, if we know that they exist at all, is the story of Judas. We know the story of Judas. We've read about it, we've learned about it, but so often we don't pay attention to the text. We don't pay attention to a line because, again, it's on suicide and it's hard to listen. It's hard to wrap your mind around. And so I'm going to read a passage from the Hebrew Bible. It is Matthew 27, verse 1 through 10, and it is on the suicide of Judas. It goes like this. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with a great remorse. He ran to the temple, returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders. He announced, I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That is on you and your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple. He left in the darkness and went away and hung himself. And also in the Gospel of John 13, 18 through 30, it goes on to talk about how the devil entered into Judas' heart to betray Jesus, how the devil lied to Judas, telling him that his death was more important than his life, that because of what he did, that he had no worth or dignity left, and that this was his only path forward. So I know for many of us, the overemphasized idea of a devil with red tail, horns, and a pitchfork seems like this far off spiritual fairy tale. So if you cannot get behind the idea of a devil as being an actual being, then think of the devil as all that goes into our lives, all that leads us, like Judas, to believe that we aren't worthy, that we don't have dignity, and that all of these options do not exist in that moment. So the devil lied to Judas. The devil lied to Judas. What we must do is seek to find a way to defy all of these lies, to embody love in all that we say and all that we do, especially around mental health and suicide. So, like many and like Judas, I have had my own thoughts of suicide. I have attempted suicide more times than I often care to admit. I've had the lies in my head, people telling me that I wasn't worthy, that because I was queer, or because I had learning disabilities, or because of this or that my life was going to be harder, that it might be easier if I just wasn't around to deal with it. And so I self-harmed. I attempted suicide. I fell victim to the lies. So many of us do, and that is okay. But we also must realize that despite the lies, they are just that, they are lies. We do have worth, we do have dignity, especially in our darkest and our worst moments. In those moments when it's the hardest to realize, that is when our worth and dignity must shine the brightest. It's when we need community the most. It is when we need a community to mend what is busted up. And what is busted up in this moment, in those moments, are the struggles that people are facing all over the world that they cannot and should not have to face alone. We must talk about suicide, but to do so, we must make sure that we ourselves are physically, emotionally, and spiritually able to address suicide and mental health in ways that best help those who need us most. So, friends and beloveds, what we must do now will not be easy by any means, but it is what is needed. We must renounce all that seeks to define love. We must remind ourselves and others of their inherent worth and dignity, and that anything else is a damn lie. We must love always, no matter what, as we work to understand the precious life that is all around us, the precious life that is lost all around us, knowing that in every moment, each and every one of us is a sacred, a holy being, worthy of love, that no person is outside this circle of love, including ourselves. So, beloveds, if you cannot believe any of what I have said this morning for yourself, please let me believe it for you. For I do not know when I may need you to believe it for me when I cannot. Blessed be Ashe. May it be so, and amen.